All right, hello, and welcome back. We're now in week 8, and this week's lecture, is going to be about cultural representation. In the last lecture from last week, we talked about who am I? Like, what is the role and effect of playing a character and performing that character in a video game? Today, I want to talk about kind of who else is there, expand this idea of identity and representation outside of the interior game context and more towards the greater world. So I'll be talking a little bit more about representation. And this is going to be sexual, political, geographical. There's a whole bunch of different types of representation that we'll be talking about. Now, principally, the majority of games are designed in the West. Or you might want to describe it as the vast majority of games are designed for a Western audience. It's kind of a subtle distinction there, but I think that it's true that the Western hegemonic culture is quite dominant in terms of video game content. Now, there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of different places that are creating their own video game content. Korea and Japan, in particular, are creating intense and quite prolific video games as well. But today, I want to talk a little bit about what does that mean for the diversity of game development. And are we just making the same games over and over again? And particularly, like, how do these Western Hemisphere games travel? How do they expand into non-Western worlds? Practically speaking, there's two different sort of aspects I want to talk about initially. The first one is localization. Localization is the process of changing the language to sell to a given region or country. So all the dialogue needs to be changed to be in French. And that's not only the written dialogue that might be on screen, but also the voice acting as well. So any new culture that has a different language needs to have a whole new set of audio and textual assets that need to be created. So that process of localization is that taking the existing content and transferring it into a new culture and language. And this is done all over the place. Like, any AAA title is going to be localized to as many different cultures as they financially can, because it just means that they can get more customers. Now, there are game developers who anticipate this need and kind of obviate the need for localization. Like, if you think of The Sims, there's no written content in The Sims, there's no spoken, they just have the Sim language. And it means that they didn't need to localize that very much at all in order to transfer it to different countries. So there are things that companies can do in order to get around this idea. But ultimately, if you're going to have a pretty narrative-heavy game, then you're going to need to do some pretty deep localization. Now, the next step up from localization, and again, not again, but to step back, localization is quite an extensive industry. There are companies that are set up that's entirely what they do, is that they take an existing game and localize it. So if you know other languages, it's quite a useful thing to get into. To step beyond that, we've got a nice red line here. To step beyond that, there's another process called the process of culturalization, which is different than just localization. Culturalization is changing the content to sell to a given region or country. So this is not just changing the text or changing the voice actors. This is actually changing the content to fit into the cultures that the game is going to. And this is really where the question of Western hegemony is getting some pushback in terms of game development. So for any given culture, there's going to be different norms that a game kind of needs to conform to. That might be sexual norms, violence norms, historical norms, or cultural details that are relevant. So in terms of sexuality or nudity, like The Witcher 3, for example, there's quite extensive nudity in that game. And in Asian countries, particularly in Japan, where that's illegal to display, the artists had to create an entirely different set of skin, video game skins like textures, so all of those characters had undergarments that would cover up their nudity. Violence in Japan is also kind of legal, like bloody representations. And so games will often have entirely different particle effects or 2D effects or art assets that remove the gore and the blood and kind of either make it into sort of a generic effect or take it off screen. I can't remember which one it was, but there's particular zombie games that in some of the cutscenes that had extreme violence towards even zombies, the action happened off screen and you wouldn't see it. So they would just kind of cut off screen. Historical details. Back in the day, the original Microsoft Age of Empires had a scenario in which Japan invaded Korea, which for most of the world, there's a historical basis for that happening. But the Korean government refused to sell the game because they take the opinion that that actually never happened. And so Microsoft went back and they made a new patch for Age of Empires in which that doesn't happen. That level was kind of changed, so Japan never invades Korea. So there's historical disagreements as to the actual facts of what happens. Some cultural details, and this can be anything from like in China, you can't show skeletons. So a lot of skeletons, because they consider it to be offensive to their ancestors. To the dead. So they, any given game that has skeletons will need to completely change those assets in order to not be skeletons. In Russia, you can't show people smoking or drinking. So any of that content needs to be removed. So these are all sort of different examples about the way how cultures can change the way the content of the game can be delivered or can be presented. And video games really need to be aware of this. And there's a whole sort of micro industry that's popping up around consultation and being consultants about video game culturalization. And I think I've got a couple links to different people as examples of these consultants who are taking on these roles and are cultural experts for hire, basically, for different game companies to make sure that their content is not going to offend anyone or go against cultural norms because they want as many customers as they possibly can. So what about game development from the rest of the world? We all know that there's a ton of games that are being made from the Western perspective. What about other perspectives? And every country out there will have game developers. It's one of the cool things that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is this insane democratization of game development through the cheapening of hardware, but also the game engines becoming really powerful and also really free. Things like Unity and Unreal, but also Game Maker and a whole bunch of other ones that are either free or cheap. So just for the next couple of minutes, I kind of want to focus on the MENA sector, which is Middle East, North Africa, because there's some really cool things going on there. It is the fastest growing international sector for game development. And this is measured every year with the Game Developer Association. And for the last several years, it has been the geographic sector that has had both the most increase in number of game developers, but also the highest increase in game development profits and income. And Egypt in 2018, for example, had the largest global game jam population, which is pretty cool. So just to kind of get a sense of how the world is changing away from this Western perspective, we're going to take a quick look at what gaming and game development looks like in the Middle East. Now, there's a sort of preconception of the Middle East as being this war-torn, ravaged, anarchic society, but in reality, it's just as much of a developed world as anywhere else. So we're going to take a quick look at how that looks. Now, in the Middle East sector, mobile dominates. The prevalence of cell phones means that everybody who has a cell phone is able to play games. You might not have an Xbox or a PlayStation or even a computer, but everyone will have a cell phone. Like most people will have cell phones. And so mobile games has just totally dominated the market. In Saudi Arabia, for example, just quite recently, the first movie to be shown since the 1970s has been Black Panther, because they just completely stopped showing movies in the 70s. So there were no movies whatsoever. Television was incredibly curtailed. So what have they been doing? They've been playing games, and the game market is incredibly robust, especially in Saudi Arabia. So you can see, there are portals that talk about games that are entirely in Arabic. They've been talking about games. They are been blogging about it. So this person here is one of the most active game commentators and developers, and he's in Bahrain. And this is all happening even though there are these incredible cultural restrictions on gaming itself. And we took a look at some of them, but we're going to kind of poke around a little bit more. So, especially in Saudi Arabia, iconography, like visual representations of deities, is incredibly, like, you cannot do it. Any alcohol or skimpy clothing is totally not shown. And just to give a kind of a sense about how strict these cultural regulations are, this is a screen grab from I believe it was Call of Duty, and this is a mirror in a bathroom, and the developers kind of took what they thought was inoffensive and generic patterning and writing and put it around the mirror, but it actually ended up referencing Allah and God, and because of that, it couldn't be put into a game. And so once it was discovered, then Saudi Arabia pulled the game altogether and refused to have it sold in Saudi Arabia. And you thought the ESRB was strict. In addition, there's also gender restrictions. So in a lot of Muslim countries, men and women cannot socialize together. And so in Saudi Arabia, for example, there's women-only game development associations and conventions that happen, which is crazy. And they're not allowed to take any pictures from within the convention. And there's rumors about these amazing cosplay competitions that happen. But again, it's all gender specific. So only women are allowed to attend this. There are political restrictions that are at play. Back a couple years ago now, when Epic first kind of started pushing into more of the Epic Store and doing more UE4 stuff, Unreal 4 stuff, you had to get an account to start developing in Unreal. And at the time, if your name was flagged in any way as being somewhat from the Middle East, then your new account was blocked. So if your first name was Mohammed or your last name was Khan, or heaven forbid, if both of those were your names, then you were unable to get an Unreal account. And it was all sort of predicated on leftovers from 9/11. And the idea that terrorist cells might be using game development tools, which is crazy and quite insane. Anyway, so at the time there was this quite an active pushback, and people were making up generic American names in order to get accounts. It was ridiculous at the time. So there, there's this incredible boom in game development, despite all of these restrictions that we might not even consider in our cultures. So I would also want to talk a little bit about representation. In the Middle East, like it's kind of for the last decade or so, it's been the go-to for recent military realism, like any given game. might take place in the Middle East, where you can blow stuff up because it's all being blown up anyway, and all these sort of ideas that it's this war ground with criminal overlords and just rampant anarchy. But in reality, like, this is Tehran. It's quite a beautiful city, quite sophisticated. I'm sorry, this is Tehran. This is in Afghanistan. This is Kabul. Beautiful cities. It's not the Middle East isn't this entirely blown out war zone. And from a sort of cultural studies standpoint, this prevalence of using the Middle East as a trope kind of ties in with this book that talks more about movies and TV, but it's pretty appropriate for games too. And the book is called Orientalism by Edward Said. And in it, he states that the Orient was almost a European invention and has been since antiquity a place of romance, exotic beings, haunted memories and landscapes, and remarkable experiences. And it's this conflict between reality versus the idea, where here in the West, we use the Middle East. We kind of consume and make the Middle East into what we think it should be in order for us to make these games where you can blow people up and have this war-torn area. It's this ability to sort of reduce complete cultures down to what we need them to be. That can be quite offensive and quite backward thinking. However, in the non-West is a useful trope for Westerners to create a narrative. It's easy for us to fall into that trap. Now, there's good examples and bad examples of using the Middle East. Konami, the 6 Days in Fallujah, which is a really, really interesting game, had this Middle East environment, but they were actually quite sensitive and quite. They tried to be as accurate as possible, and they had a whole bunch of consultants on this, not only from the U.S. military but also people from Afghanistan. And they tried to make the game as accurate and as real a representation as possible. They consulted with widows and veterans, and to try and get a real good sense of the game itself, of the experience of being in Fallujah in this standoff. At the far end of the spectrum, we've got America's Army, which is developed by the American Army, the U.S. Army. Which is kind of crazy, but it kind of perpetuates a lot of these stereotypes, and they have a very political reason for doing so, because they want to, the U.S. Army wants to perpetuate this notion of the other, because the other is easier to shoot should you need to. And there's also a lot more problematic stuff about America's Army, this video game, principally because the U.S. Army distributes this game for free, but then uses the data from the game to target people who are particularly adept at the game in order to recruit them. So it becomes a recruiting tool as well, which is super insidious and super creepy. So what about non-Western developers? What about people who are in the Middle East who are developing? Well, to kind of counteract America's Army, Hezbollah have made video games themselves. One game is called Holy Defense, and in it you take the part of a Hezbollah soldier, and you're trying to repel Western invaders. And it uses hyper-realistic, uses the exact same tools that Western companies use. And to kind of subvert the idea that they are terrorists and the bad guys. And indeed, developers kind of draw upon the same ideas, the same sort of tropes of violence and anarchy. If it's a developer in that country or at that place using those tropes, is it still a trope? Like, is it still a problematic at that time? And that's a tough question to answer. Even here in the West, we do that same thing as well. Like we kind of glorify our own background. In the Wild West, we kind of, for example, in the U.S. at least, we glorify this historical narrative where the white man was conquering the Wild West. And that's incredibly problematic. But at the same time, it's is it what we own? I don't know. It's difficult to say. And even modern stuff, like we take a look at Grand Theft Auto, and the glorification of this again anarchic South Central LA scene where anything goes, and you've got guns and cars and this sort of really romanticized hyper violent glorification of these cultures. Okay, so what does this mean for us? Here, I'm going to kind of bring it back to our class itself. What does it mean for us? So we are not in the US. Here in New Zealand, despite my accent, we're not even in the West. Like technically, we're sort of more closer related culturally in a lot of ways to Southeast Asia and Polynesia than we are to the UK or America. So what does this mean? What does game development look like in Aotearoa, New Zealand? And this is kind of my segue to next week, but just to lead it off, we're going to take a look at the New Zealand Story, which is a game made in Japan that takes place in New Zealand and is kind of crazy. And there are also, representations of the Maori in game development as well. And we'll take a look at that. So that brings me to the end of this given lecture right now in terms of representation. Please hop on to the Discord lecture chat and talk about any sort of cultural interesting things that you might have seen in your gameplay. Things that either taught you something about someone else's culture, or perhaps was surprising in terms of representation of another people. And let's have a good conversation about it. Okay. We'll see you next week.